How did people in ancient times deal with body odor and bad breath? Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a time before toothpaste, before soap, and long before deodorant commercials tried to convince us that we smell like summer rain or mountain breeze. Go ahead, settle in. Maybe dim the lights. Let the day melt away. Because tonight, we're talking about something deeply human, and faintly unpleasant. Body odor. And its equally offensive companion, bad breath. Now, I know. This might not sound like a particularly soothing topic. But don't worry, we're not here to shame our ancestors. They did their best. Sort of. We're just going to glide through time, gently observing the various ways ancient people tried, and mostly failed, to smell acceptable. Let's start, very far back. Before history, before perfume, before civilization. Imagine a prehistoric cave somewhere around 40,000 years ago. The fire crackles softly. The air is thick with smoke and mammoth fat. Our ancestors, let's call them Greg and Alga, have just returned from a long day of hunting, or possibly running from something larger than themselves. They don't have soap. They don't have toothpaste. But they do have noses, which means, tragically, they can smell each other. Archaeologists and anthropologists suggest that early humans bathed when water was available, usually rivers or lakes, but mostly for comfort, not cleanliness. They might have rubbed themselves with sand or ashes to scrub off dirt. And if they were particularly fancy, they used animal fats to soften the skin afterward. But let's be honest, for most of human history, people probably smelled like a combination of wood smoke, sweat, and regret. Still, early humans did have some tricks. In ancient Egypt, around 5,000 years ago, things got significantly more fragrant. Egypt, where cleanliness was next to godliness, and sometimes perfume. Egyptians were obsessed with hygiene. In fact, cleanliness was tied to spiritual purity, and since their gods were very easily offended, everyone made an effort to smell divine. They bathed daily, sometimes several times a day, using natron, a naturally occurring salt, mixed with water. It was harsh, yes, but it worked. Think of it as ancient Egyptian soap, minus the pleasant fragrance and plus a slight chemical burn. But what really set the Egyptians apart was their love of scent. Perfume wasn't just a luxury. It was a civic duty. We know this because even the poorest Egyptians were buried with little jars of scented oil, presumably so they wouldn't embarrass themselves in the afterlife. And they had some creative approaches. They made cones of perfumed wax, placed directly on the head. Yes, on the head. During banquets, these wax cones slowly melted, releasing a flow of lotus oil down the neck and into the hair. Which sounds elegant, until you remember it's 110 degrees, and you're basically sitting in your own scented candle. Still, it worked. The result was a heady mix of sweat, beeswax, and imported myrrh, which, in fairness, was probably better than the alternative. As for the mouth, the Egyptians were equally inventive. They made what might be the world's first breath mints. Recipes survive on papyrus scrolls, crushed frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and honey, rolled into little pellets. They were supposed to sweeten the breath, which is a polite way of saying that everyone's mouth smelled like fermented onions. But again, for the time, it was an upgrade. Greece, the land of oil and odor. Now, if we float forward 1,000 years or so, we land in ancient Greece. The Greeks, being Greeks, turned bathing into a social event. They didn't just wash. They philosophized about washing. Public baths were where you'd go to clean up, debate the meaning of virtue, and occasionally show off your sculpted abs. But their cleansing method was interesting. They didn't use soap. Not yet. Instead, they rubbed olive oil all over their bodies, which, admittedly, sounds like something you'd see in a modern spa commercial. Then they scraped it all off again with a curved metal tool called a strigil. This removed sweat, dirt, and the top layer of your dignity. The result? A smooth, slightly oily glow, perfect for standing around in a toga, pretending to enjoy Plato's latest rant about ideal forms. For the mouth, the Greeks also had ideas. They chewed aromatic resins, like mastic gum, which freshened the breath and cleaned the teeth, somewhat. They also rinsed with vinegar or wine, because of course they did. If you're going to have bad breath, you might as well make it smell like the symposium. Rome, the empire of bathing, and questionable plumbing. Next stop, Rome. Because if there's one thing Romans loved more than conquering people, it was bathing after doing it. Roman baths were vast complexes, hot rooms, cold rooms, pools, massage tables, steam chambers, and gossip corners. Everyone went, senators, soldiers, slaves. It was the ancient world's version of a day spa crossed with a public forum. They used soap made from animal fat and ashes, a technology they learned from the Celts. Which is amusing, since the Romans liked to think of the Celts as barbarians. And yet, they stole their hygiene products. Romans perfumed themselves lavishly. Oils, salves, powders, even perfumed gloves. The Emperor Nero reportedly bathed in rose petals and milk. And yes, that's the same Nero who later burned half of Rome, so his priorities were clearly consistent. To mask bad breath, Romans used mouth rinses of vinegar, salt, and crushed herbs. Dentists also existed, usually terrifying ones with bronze tools and no anesthesia. They used toothpicks made of precious metals, and sometimes rubbed their teeth with powdered pumice or crushed bones. So if you ever think whitening toothpaste is abrasive, imagine scrubbing your teeth with a rock. The Middle Ages, the fragrant decline. Then, as the Roman Empire fell apart, so did everyone's bathing habits. For much of medieval Europe, washing was no longer fashionable. Partly because people believed that water opened the pores, and disease could sneak in. So instead, they simply covered the smell. Perfumed gloves, herbs sewn into clothing, little bags of lavender tucked near the armpits. If you've ever wondered where the idea of a sachet came from, it's basically medieval deodorant. The wealthy also had wooden pomanders, hollow spheres filled with spices, carried around to mask the surrounding horror. You might recognize these from portraits, small orbs dangling from a chain. That wasn't jewelry. That was survival. And since actual soap was rare and expensive, the average person used ashes, sand, or bread crumbs as body scrubs. Which sounds ridiculous, until you realize modern exfoliants aren't much different. As for the mouth, things got grim. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist. Instead, people used cloth, twigs, or even bird feathers to scrape the teeth. There were homemade mouth rinses too, wine, vinegar, mint water, though these mostly made you smell like salad dressing. In fairness, people didn't necessarily have bad hygiene by their standards. They just had different priorities. A clean soul mattered more than a clean body. And if you could afford a spritz of imported rose oil, that counted as bathing in style. The Islamic Golden Age, soap, science, and citrus. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, people were doing things rather differently, and far more effectively. Muslim scholars and inventors actually perfected the art of soap making. They combined animal fats with lye, adding herbs and essential oils for scent. This was real, functional soap, the kind that actually cleansed instead of just moving dirt around. Regular bathing was encouraged, both for health and religious reasons. And public bathhouses, hammams, became essential parts of daily life. They also valued oral hygiene. The miswak, a small twig from the Salvadora persica tree, was used to clean teeth. It contains natural antibacterial compounds, meaning it worked better than most medieval European methods for the next 1,000 years. So while Europe smelled faintly of despair and candle wax, the Islamic world smelled like orange blossom and soap. Renaissance Europe, perfume, powder, and denial. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe rediscovered soap, but bathing still hadn't caught on. The wealthy bathed rarely. Queen Elizabeth I, for instance, reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. They relied on perfume. Lots of perfume. Lavender water, rose oil, and musk were the favorites. France became the perfume capital of Europe, partly because everyone there desperately needed it. Court life at Versailles was glamorous on the surface, but the smell was complicated. Tooth care improved slightly. People brushed with sticks of licorice root or cloth dipped in wine and honey. Which, to be fair, sounds like an improvement until you consider the dental decay rate. In portraits, everyone looks powdered, serene, and ethereal, but if you could actually smell those portraits, you'd open a window immediately. The Enlightenment and soap's comeback. By the 18th century, scientists began to understand that cleanliness could prevent disease. Bathing slowly became fashionable again, especially among the upper classes, who loved new gadgets. Portable bathtubs appeared. Perfumed soaps became luxury items. And by the 19th century, with advances in plumbing, the idea of daily washing finally began to spread. Toothpaste evolved from crushed chalk and salt into something vaguely minty. And soon, odor became a social taboo, an invention of marketing, but an effective one. Companies began selling deodorant and mouthwash, not because people suddenly smelled worse, but because someone realized they could monetize insecurity. And that, really, is where we've remained ever since, locked in a centuries-long arms race against our own biology. Floating to the present. If you take a moment to think about it, our obsession with smelling good is one of the oldest human rituals. From Egyptians melting perfume cones to Romans bathing in public, to modern influencers unboxing luxury fragrances, it's the same impulse. We all just want to be clean, or at least, to appear that way. We want to belong. And if we can smell faintly like sandalwood and confidence while doing it, even better. So, the next time you pick up your deodorant or toothpaste, remember, you're continuing a ritual that's older than history. A lineage of sweet-smelling, mildly desperate people who just wanted to be a little less unbearable to stand next to. Let's drift, quietly now. Because our ancestors, even the smelly ones, deserve their rest. And so do you. What happened to royal mistresses when their kings died? Hey everyone. Welcome back. Tonight we're drifting through the corridors of palaces, quiet now, except for the faint echo of silk and scandal. Go ahead, get comfortable. Let your phone screen dim a little. And if you're listening in the dark, even better. Because tonight, we're going to whisper about a rather overlooked group of people. The women who ruled hearts, and sometimes empires, but only until their lover stopped breathing. Yes. Royal mistresses. And the question that nobody really wants to ask out loud. What happened to them when the king died? It's a delicate subject, really. History remembers kings for their wars, and their wives for their jewels. But the mistresses, the unofficial wives, the comforters, the sometimes political advisors, tend to vanish from the story the moment the crown changes heads. Sometimes they ended up rich beyond belief. Sometimes they were exiled overnight. And sometimes, they simply didn't wake up the next morning. So tonight, we'll drift through the lives, and afterlives, of a few of them. Not the mistresses of myth and romance, but the real ones. The women who learned that a royal favor could be the softest pillow one day, and the guillotine's block the next. Let's start, gently, with the French. Because France, to be fair, perfected the art of the royal mistress. They even had a title for it, maîtresse en titre, literally, official mistress. Which is an admirably bureaucratic way to describe adultery. Being the king's mistress in France was practically a court position. You got apartments in Versailles, servants, jewels, and an entire budget line for personal whims. You might also get insulted by everyone behind your back, but that was standard for Versailles anyway. And yet, it was all conditional. Conditional on the king's affection, his health, and above all, his continued existence. Because when the king died, the mistress did not die with him, not officially, anyway. But her power did. Let's drift to the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. A man who bathed in glory, perfume, and political hypocrisy. He had several mistresses, but the two most famous were Madame de Montespan and Madame de Maintenon. Madame de Montespan was witty, beautiful, and ambitious, which, in 17th-century France, was 3 strikes already. She bore Louis several children and ruled the court with venom-laced charm. But then came the affair of the poisons, a scandal involving witchcraft, black masses, and the rumor that she had prayed for the queen's death. Louis, naturally, was horrified, not enough to punish her publicly, but just enough to stop calling. When he moved on to Madame de Maintenon, a woman of far greater piety and far less fun, Montespan was quietly dismissed. Her apartments were emptied, her jewels returned, and her name whispered like a bad memory. She spent her remaining years in a convent. Repenting. Allegedly. Though one imagines her prayers were somewhat pointed. Now, Madame de Maintenon, the replacement, fared a little better. She was discreet, clever, and, crucially, outlived Louis. Some say they even married in secret. When he died in 1715, she retreated, gracefully, to a school for impoverished noble girls that she had founded. No one exiled her, because technically, she might have been the queen. But no one adored her either. She faded like a candle that had burned too cleanly to be interesting. That was the best-case scenario for a mistress. Peaceful retirement. Modest wealth. A polite silence. Most didn't get that lucky. Let's drift a few decades forward, to Madame de Pompadour. The most famous mistress of Louis XV. A woman who made being a mistress look like a career, and it truly was one. She hosted salons, commissioned architecture, and practically ran France's cultural life. She even managed to stay in the king's favor long after their romantic relationship ended, an extraordinary feat in a world where affection usually expired faster than milk. She died before the king did, which, historically, was the most elegant way to end things. But when Louis himself finally followed, her successor, Madame du Barry, learned the harder version of the story. Du Barry was not born noble. She was beautiful, charming, and from a working-class background, 3 things guaranteed to make the French aristocracy hate you. Louis XV adored her. But when he died in 1774, her entire world evaporated overnight. The new king, Louis XVI, and his young wife, Marie Antoinette, despised her existence. She was exiled from court within days. Her jewels were confiscated. Her carriages returned. For a while, she lived quietly in the countryside. But then came the revolution. And the revolution was not in a forgiving mood. She was arrested, accused of hoarding wealth and conspiring with émigrés. At her trial, she wept, begged, and pleaded, all of which was considered undignified, especially by people planning to decapitate you anyway. She was guillotined in 1793. A fittingly gruesome end for someone who once ruled Versailles by perfume and charm. England's royal mistresses had their own peculiar destinies. The English, being the English, managed to turn adultery into both a scandal and a form of entertainment. During the Restoration, King Charles II had so many mistresses that he nearly turned the monarchy into a family business. He fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, possibly more, depending on who was counting and why. But he was, by all accounts, affectionate toward his mistresses. He gave them titles, estates, and moderately affectionate nicknames like, Pretty, Witty Nell. That would be Nell Gwyn, perhaps the most beloved royal mistress in British history. Nell wasn't born noble either. She started as an orange seller in the theatre, which sounds quaint, but was really slang for, probably also a part-time courtesan. She caught the king's eye, and somehow, against all probability, kept his affection for years. When Charles died in 1685, she lost her protector, her income, and her security in a single heartbeat. But his brother, James II, actually honored the king's dying wish, let not poor Nellie starve. And so she didn't. She lived comfortably until her death, surrounded by debts, memories, and faintly embarrassed courtiers. The fate of royal mistresses, though, depended entirely on who came next. If the new monarch was sympathetic, or related, you might be allowed to fade gently into the background. If not, you were a walking embarrassment that had to be removed, preferably to a distant estate with poor ventilation. For instance, when King George II of Britain died, his longtime mistress, Henrietta Howard, had already sensibly retired years earlier. She had bought herself a villa, created an elegant garden, and filled it with poetry rather than politics. She died peacefully, which in the world of royal mistresses, was an achievement bordering on sainthood. Across Europe, though, the story repeated. Kings died. Queens sighed with relief. And mistresses either reinvented themselves or were quietly erased. In Spain, royal mistresses were often cloaked in official silence, acknowledged by everyone, named by no one. One of the most infamous was Maria de Padilla, mistress to King Peter of Castile in the 14th century. She was said to be his true love, but when he died, her body was dug up and reburied with full queenly honors. A touching gesture, though one she was sadly unable to appreciate. But perhaps no one illustrates the awkward twilight of mistresshood better than Catherine Dolgorukova, the mistress of Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Alexander, known as the Tsar Liberator, for freeing the serfs, was also known for his deeply impractical love life. He was married to Empress Maria Alexandrovna, frail, devout, and perpetually ill. And then he met Catherine, a much younger woman, the daughter of a minor noble family. He fell in love, spectacularly and inconveniently. He installed her in the Winter Palace, scandalizing absolutely everyone. They had children. And when his wife finally died, he married Catherine in secret, a morganatic marriage, meaning she could never be empress. When he was assassinated in 1881, by a bomb thrown in St. Petersburg, she was there. She cradled him as he died. And then, Within hours, she was ordered out of the palace. Her possessions were seized. Her children stripped of their titles. She lived the rest of her life abroad, writing melancholy letters about lost love and Russian winters. Technically, she had been a royal mistress turned secret wife. But in the end, she was simply a widow with no country. In a way, mistresses were the most fragile creatures of monarchy. They had everything, wealth, jewels, influence, but all of it balanced on the breath of one man. The moment he exhaled for the last time, their entire existence became inconvenient. Some adapted. They remarried quietly, or reinvented themselves as patrons of art, or founders of schools. Some even became nuns, though probably not out of sudden piety. Others did not adapt. They were too visible, too resented, too easy to blame. The same courtiers who once bowed to them now whispered, she was the reason the king failed. And in the smooth machinery of monarchy, blame had to go somewhere. What's fascinating, or perhaps a little tragic, is how history treats them. Royal mistresses are often remembered only for their beauty, or their scandal. But many were intelligent, educated, and influential. They advised on policy. They sponsored artists. They softened tyrants. And sometimes, they made tyrants worse. They existed in the gray space between power and peril, never quite secure, never quite legitimate. The court adored them in daylight and despised them by dinner. And when their kings died, they were suddenly ordinary women again. Which, in a palace, is the most dangerous thing to be. If you walk through the old palaces of Europe, Versailles, Hampton Court, Schönbrunn, you can still find traces of them. A faded portrait. A locked door to a private apartment. A note in a diary, written in the margins, where a queen dared not mention her rival by name. Most of their graves are modest. No statues. No crowns. Just names, sometimes not even the right ones. But for a few years, or a few nights, they ruled kings. And in that sense, they ruled the world. So if you ever find yourself drifting off while imagining the glittering candlelight of a royal court, remember that behind every shining crown, there was often a woman in shadow, waiting for her king to die, and wondering whether she'd be allowed to live. How did medieval people keep warm in winter without modern heating? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before central heating, before wool socks came in 6-packs, and long before anyone thought to insulate a castle. Settle in. Pull your blanket up a little higher. Because as we drift through history tonight, we're entering winter, medieval winter, which is to say, several months of mild frostbite, smoky fireplaces, and the faint smell of damp wool. Let's take a slow walk through the Middle Ages, and see how people kept warm, or at least, how they tried. It's easy, in our heated modern houses, to imagine medieval winters as picturesque. Snow falling on castle towers. Candles glowing in narrow windows. A minstrel playing something vaguely out of tune in a corner. But in reality, it was miserable. Europe's climate went through what historians call the Little Ice Age, roughly from the 14th to the 19th centuries, when winters were colder, longer, and less poetic. Rivers froze solid. Crops failed. And people invented new and creative ways to be uncomfortable. So, how did they manage? How did an entire continent survive centuries of cold without so much as a thermostat? Let's start, quietly, with the peasants. Because, as usual, they did most of the surviving. Your average medieval peasant lived in a single-room hut made of wattle and daub, that's a polite term for sticks, mud, and wishful thinking. The floor was dirt. The roof leaked. The walls occasionally froze. But the family, the animals, and the cooking fire were all in the same space, which, though smoky, provided a certain rustic warmth. It wasn't pleasant. But a cow is, technically, a space heater with hooves. At night, families often slept together under heaps of wool and linen, sometimes with the family dog, or goat, pressed in for warmth. Privacy was a luxury, but body heat was essential. Medieval people knew the value of shared discomfort. The fire burned in the center of the room, often without a chimney. The smoke just sort of drifted out through a hole in the roof, assuming the wind was feeling cooperative. If not, it lingered, coating everything, lungs included, in a fine layer of soot. The benefit, if we can call it that, was that the smoke killed insects. So you couldn't breathe easily, but at least the fleas were gone. The wealthy, meanwhile, had their own problems. Castles looked grand from the outside, all stone and majesty, but stone, as it turns out, is not a particularly warm material. A medieval castle in winter was essentially a large, decorative refrigerator. Those massive walls trapped the cold beautifully. They were designed for defense, not comfort. After all, an enemy catapult couldn't get through them, but neither could a draft of warm air. So the nobility layered everything: rugs, hangings, furs, and arrogance. Their great halls had enormous fireplaces, often large enough to roast an ox, but the heat barely reached beyond a few meters. Sit too close, and your front would roast while your back froze. Sit too far away, and you'd just freeze more evenly. Even the servants tasked with tending the fires complained about the chill, not that anyone listened. Servants, as a rule, were expected to generate their own warmth through productivity. Let's drift, for a moment, into the clothing. Because medieval people layered with an enthusiasm that modern fashion could only envy. The base layer was linen, soft, absorbent, and surprisingly practical. Over that came wool, the unsung hero of the medieval wardrobe. Wool was warm even when wet, which was fortunate, since medieval England was essentially a damp sponge half the year. People wore tunics, cloaks, and hose. Sometimes several tunics. And cloaks lined with fur if they could afford it. The wealthy favored fur trims, ermine, sable, and fox, though they occasionally wore entire animals. One medieval account mentions a lady who arrived at a feast wrapped in 12 furs. One can only imagine the smell when she sat too close to the fire. Gloves, hats, and hoods were also common. A medieval hood was a kind of all-purpose head and shoulder covering that could be pulled forward in the wind or draped elegantly indoors. Think of it as the medieval version of a hoodie, but made of scratchy wool and weighing 5 pounds. At night, people wore night rails, long linen garments, and often slept with woolen caps. Which sounds excessive until you remember that their bedrooms were roughly the temperature of an unheated barn. In fact, they were unheated barns, in many cases. Now, let's glide up the social ladder a little, to royalty. Because kings and queens, despite having the best of everything, were still at war with the cold. Take Henry VIII, for example. He built massive palaces like Hampton Court, filled with fireplaces, 1,200 of them, and still managed to complain about drafts. Even his personal chambers were cold enough that servants slept in the doorway to keep the heat from escaping. Henry was famous for his layers of clothing, padded doublets, fur-lined cloaks, and the occasional display of enough fabric to upholster a small carriage. He also had something called a warming pan. Basically a metal dish filled with hot coals, slid between the sheets before bed. It was an effective way to take the chill off the linens, and an excellent way to set your bed on fire if you weren't careful. Queen Elizabeth I, his daughter, used similar methods, except her bed was stuffed with feathers and surrounded by thick curtains to trap heat. These bed curtains were a staple of wealthy households, not just decorative, but essential insulation. Once you were in, you stayed in. Getting up in the morning was an act of bravery. Ordinary people, of course, didn't have feather beds. They had straw pallets. The straw would be changed a few times a year, or when it began to move on its own. It wasn't ideal, but if you piled on enough blankets, it worked. And medieval blankets were heavy. Wool, woven thick, sometimes layered with fur. People slept under so much weight they could barely roll over. It wasn't called a weighted blanket, but the effect was much the same, minus the marketing. Now, let's talk about heating innovation, or the lack thereof. For centuries, Europe relied almost entirely on open hearths. A hole in the floor, a fire, and a prayer. Chimneys existed by the 12th century, but they were rare and expensive. Early versions didn't even draft properly, smoke often filled the upper rooms. And yet, a smoky house was considered cozy. Later, things improved. Medieval stoves appeared, large ceramic or brick structures heated from a fire below. These were particularly popular in Germany and Scandinavia, where frostbite was practically a national pastime. The tile stove, or Kachelofen, was an early miracle of efficiency. It retained heat for hours, even after the fire died. Families gathered around them in winter, basking in the rare luxury of consistent warmth. Meanwhile, in England, they mostly just layered more blankets and complained. Because of course they did. Let's drift back to the castles for a moment, to see how their architecture made warmth almost impossible. Medieval builders loved open space. Great halls with high ceilings, vast windows, eventually, and stone everywhere. Heat rises, of course, so most of it ended up floating near the rafters, while the people below shivered politely. Tapestries were the medieval solution. They weren't just art, they were insulation. Hanging a thick tapestry on a cold stone wall could make a room feel several degrees warmer. And it conveniently hid the drafts. Some castles even had wall hangings made from woven straw or felt. Functional, though not exactly fashionable. Still, it was better than sleeping beside a bare wall that radiated pure February. Now, let's drift outside, to the winter work. Because warmth wasn't just about comfort. It was survival. People chopped wood obsessively. Firewood was currency in cold months. Poorer families collected anything that burned, peat, dried dung, even old thatch. If it made heat, it was precious. Fires were never allowed to go out. A hearth fire was the heart of the home, literally and symbolically. Every night, someone would bank the fire, covering it with ashes to keep the embers alive until morning. Rekindling it was a ritual. Losing it was a small disaster. When entire villages faced shortages of fuel, they huddled together in barns, churches, or halls, sharing warmth and gossip in equal measure. Humanity, as ever, survived through collective complaining. Let's take a soft detour into medieval superstition, because, naturally, they made it worse. People believed that sudden heat was unhealthy. That moving from cold to warm too quickly could shock the humors. So instead of standing near the fire, some preferred to remain, properly chilled, for balance. Doctors of the time even recommended keeping windows open, for fresh air, during freezing weather. It was thought to prevent plague. It mostly prevented sleep. Still, habits die hard. And if the choice was between medical advice and comfort, many chose the advice. Then promptly got pneumonia. By the 15th century, Europe began to rediscover luxury heating. Noble homes installed multiple fireplaces. Servants carried portable braziers, small metal bowls of burning coals, from room to room. Ladies of the court sometimes held hand warmers, delicate metal spheres filled with embers, tucked into their sleeves or skirts. They looked elegant, until you remembered they were literally carrying fire around under their clothes. One suspects that many fine medieval gowns ended their days smoldering quietly in a corridor somewhere. Even monasteries, those havens of prayer and restraint, were not immune to winter's bite. Monks followed strict schedules, waking before dawn for prayers in unheated chapels. Their robes were wool, their beds simple, and their tolerance impressive. In particularly cold regions, monasteries sometimes had one heated room, called the kale factory, where monks could thaw their fingers between writing sessions. It's hard to imagine a more miserable place to copy manuscripts than a freezing stone scriptorium. And yet, they did. So if you own a medieval book, appreciate it. It was written by someone with numb hands. By late medieval times, urban homes began improving too. Glass windows appeared, small, expensive, and drafty, but better than open holes. Curtains became thicker. Fireplaces smaller and more efficient. Still, the poor remained cold. Most city dwellers slept with hats on, or drank warm ale before bed. And yes, people really did heat stones in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them under the covers. The original hot water bottle, courtesy of the Middle Ages. When we think of winter now, candles flickering, fires crackling, it feels romantic. But for medieval people, winter was the season of endurance. A time to burn everything you could find, wear every piece of clothing you owned, and hope the frost didn't kill the crops, or you. And yet, there's something quietly admirable about it. They survived. Not through comfort, but through adaptation. Through sheer, stubborn willpower, and perhaps a little help from their livestock. So tonight, as you drift off beneath your soft blanket, spare a thought for the medieval world. For the peasants asleep in smoky huts, the nobles shivering in their stone palaces, the monks whispering prayers in icy halls. They didn't have radiators or fleece or even proper chimneys. But they had fire. And hope. And an astonishing ability to complain about the cold, a tradition humanity continues proudly to this day. What did people actually wear under their armor? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when fashion met function, and function involved not dying in battle. Settle in. Find your most comfortable position, maybe adjust your pillow. Because tonight, we're talking about something most medieval movies forget. What did people actually wear under all that armor? It's not a question you often hear asked. Hollywood usually skips straight to the clanking, shiny part. Knights galloping through forests, armor glinting, dramatic music swelling. But no one ever stops to consider that underneath that armor, there was a man, sweating profusely, wondering how long it would take before he fainted. Let's take a calm, slightly overheated walk through what it actually meant to dress for battle, medieval style. Now, at first glance, medieval armor looks impressive. Layers of polished steel. Intricate buckles. A gleaming helmet that turns your head into an angry tin can. But armor was heavy, anywhere from 40 to 80 pounds, depending on the period. And steel, famously, is not known for its breathability. So naturally, knights needed something between their skin and the metal. Otherwise, every movement would be a small act of self-harm. Enter the hidden side of chivalry, medieval underwear. Let's start with the basics, the foundation of every knightly ensemble, the linen undergarments. At the very bottom, the knight wore something called brays, loose-fitting linen shorts, tied at the waist with a cord. They were essentially the medieval version of boxer shorts, though slightly less flattering. Think of a pillowcase with ambitions. Over those came chausses, tight-fitting leggings, also made of linen or wool. They were tied to the brays with laces or cords. This was before elastic, so medieval people lived their lives one knot at a time. Now, this combination, brays and chausses, was not unique to knights. Most men wore something similar. But for those preparing to step into armor, it was just the first of many layers. Next came the gambeson, or arming doublet, arguably the unsung hero of medieval warfare. The gambeson was a thick, padded jacket, quilted with linen and stuffed with wool, horsehair, or even scraps of fabric. It looked a little like a quilted bathrobe designed by someone with anger issues. And it was crucial. Not only did it cushion the body against the weight of the armor, it absorbed the shock of blows. A sword might not cut through steel, but the impact could still feel like being kicked by a horse. The gambeson softened that, slightly. It also prevented the armor from chafing, which sounds minor until you imagine a steel plate rubbing against your collarbone all day. Without it, even the bravest knight would end the day crying quietly in a corner. Now, it's important to note, there were many versions of gambesons. Some were sleeveless, others had long sleeves. Some were so thick they could stop an arrow on their own. Poorer soldiers, who couldn't afford proper armor, sometimes wore gambesons as armor. In fact, a well-made padded coat could be surprisingly effective. Not glamorous, but functional. Like medieval sweatpants with a death wish. Knights, however, wore theirs beneath mail or plate. And that's where things started getting complicated. Let's drift over to the next layer, chain mail, or more properly, mail. Mail was made of thousands of interlocking iron rings, riveted together by hand. A full hauberk, that's a mail shirt, could weigh over 30 pounds. And knights wore it over the gambeson. If you're picturing the sensation of walking around inside a heavy metal blanket, you're not far off. Mail didn't breathe. It didn't stretch. And in summer, it turned into a mobile sauna. The result was that most knights were perpetually sweaty, itchy, and vaguely irritable. The smell, one suspects, could melt paint. But it wasn't all discomfort. Mail had its charms. It was flexible, strong, and looked rather dashing from a distance. And because it was made to order, each hauberk was tailored to fit, as much as anything made of steel rings can be tailored. Knights often wore a coif, a hood of mail, over their heads and shoulders. Under that, a padded arming cap. That way, the metal didn't dig directly into their skulls when someone tried to separate their head from their body. Thoughtful, really. Now, once full-plate armor arrived in the late Middle Ages, the layering became even more elaborate. The gambeson remained, though thinner now, and over it came the arming doublet. This was a specially fitted jacket, often lined with linen and reinforced with stitching. It had laces, or points, sewn into it, used to attach individual pieces of armor directly to the body. Yes, you didn't just wear armor, you tied it to yourself. Piece by piece. Arm plates, shoulder guards, cuisses for the thighs, greaves for the shins. All laced, buckled, or strapped in place. It took about half an hour to dress a knight properly. And they rarely did it alone. A good squire was worth his weight in patience. Under all that metal, there was also the matter of temperature. Contrary to popular belief, plate armor didn't cook you alive. At least, not immediately. Steel conducts heat well, so in hot weather it became a wearable oven. But in winter, it actually kept nights surprisingly warm. Like a medieval thermos. Unfortunately, it also trapped sweat, and medieval hygiene being what it was, most gambesons were, let's say, well seasoned. Washing them was difficult. So instead, they were aired out, occasionally scraped, and quietly resented. Let's drift for a moment to something rarely discussed, the armor stink. A 15th century chronicler once remarked that a knight's equipment smelled of man and horse. Which is a polite way of saying, terrible. Armor trapped every drop of sweat, oil, and general battlefield grime. Removing it at the end of the day must have been like opening a very personal, metallic oven. Still, knights accepted it. Because, well, it was better than being stabbed. Now, if you're imagining a knight wearing nothing but metal, a kind of mobile tin man, think again. There was always fabric between the body and the steel. Even gloves, or gauntlets, were worn over padded undergloves. Boots were layered too, linen socks, wool hose, then steel sabatons on top. Medieval soldiers were essentially walking bundles of laundry, wrapped in metal. Let's pause to appreciate the sheer practicality of all this. Underarmor wasn't glamorous, but it was essential engineering. Each layer served a purpose: comfort, protection, flexibility. Without the padding, armor would bruise, crush, or simply slide out of place. With it, a knight could move surprisingly well. Contrary to myth, full plate armor did not make you immobile. Knights could run, jump, even vault onto horses, assuming they hadn't already fainted from dehydration. The myth of the clumsy, lumbering knight likely comes from seeing very old or ceremonial suits of armor. Battle armor was much more practical. Not comfortable, exactly, but functional in the way that only centuries of desperate necessity can achieve. Of course, not everyone could afford such luxury discomfort. Lesser soldiers wore simpler gear, padded coats, leather jerkins, or partial mail. Their underlayers were rougher, their armor mismatched. A peasant archer might wear a single gambeson and call it a day. No shining plate, no coif, just a wool cap and a quiet hope of not being noticed. Because being comfortable in battle was less important than being alive. Women, too, occasionally donned armor, especially in sieges or rebellions. Joan of Arc famously wore a full suit, complete with padding beneath. She described it as heavy and awkward, though she handled it better than most men. The question of what she wore underneath remains politely unrecorded, but it was likely the same as any soldier: linen, wool, and a stubborn sense of purpose. Let's drift now to the ritual of arming. Before battle, knights didn't just throw on their gear, it was a process. Layer by layer, piece by piece. It was often done in silence, or with prayers. Each buckle, each strap tightened by a squire, was part of a quiet preparation for chaos. Some described it as meditative. Others, less romantically, described it as the worst part of the day. Once fully dressed, a knight might weigh as much as 2 men combined. But for all that, he was one of the best protected humans in history. Let's not forget the psychological comfort of armor. Under all those layers, a knight could feel invincible. Steel between him and the world. The weight, though immense, became a kind of reassurance, tangible proof that he was ready. Of course, once the arrows started flying, that confidence tended to evaporate. But still, for a few moments, all that linen and leather and steel offered a kind of calm. A very heavy, very sweaty calm. There were, naturally, some Downsides. For example, armor made certain bodily functions awkward. If nature called mid-battle, one had two choices: remove everything, slowly, or just, adapt. Chroniclers don't mention it, but let's be realistic. When a full suit of plate takes 30 minutes to remove, practicality wins. Hence the importance of those linen undergarments. Disposable, absorbent, and quietly heroic. As the centuries passed, armor evolved, and so did what people wore underneath. By the Renaissance, padded doublets became fashionable on their own. The once practical arming garments turned into stylish outerwear. Men strutted around in quilted coats that said, "I may not be in battle, but I could be, and I'd look good doing it." It's strange to think that so much of medieval warfare, so much noise, glory, and fear, began with the quiet act of dressing. A man, alone or with his squire, tying cords, adjusting layers, preparing to vanish inside steel. Underneath it all, he was just human. Soft, fragile, worried. Wearing linen that probably hadn't been washed since Lent. The armor made him seem powerful. But inside, he was sweating like everyone else. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the gentle rustle of linen, the slow tightening of straps, the muted clink of metal buckles. A knight preparing for dawn. Not the romantic hero of legend, but a tired man in too many layers, sighing as his squire tightens one more buckle. Because before glory, there was discomfort. And before the shining armor, there was a very itchy shirt.
Why did medieval people think bathing was dangerous? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when a warm bath was considered less an indulgence, and more a medical emergency. Go ahead and dim the lights. Settle under your blanket. Maybe even sip some tea, something pleasantly warm and faintly medieval, like chamomile or disappointment. Because tonight, we're stepping into the world of medieval hygiene. Or rather, the lack of it. Let's float gently back to an era when people looked at water, that clear, life-giving miracle, and said, "No, thank you. That's how you catch diseases." Now, to be fair, this wasn't always the case. Early medieval Europe actually loved baths. The Romans, as you probably know, were obsessed with them: public baths, private baths, elaborate bathing rituals that made cleanliness practically a civic duty. And after the Roman Empire fell, much of Europe kept the habit alive, at least for a while. Monasteries had bathhouses. Towns had public steam baths, often called stews, pleasant, social places where you could soak, chat, and occasionally, catch something other than conversation. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was recreation. People brought food, music, even wine. It was like a medieval spa day, minus the cucumber slices and plus a few questionable business transactions. But by the late Middle Ages, something changed. The bathhouse, once a symbol of civility, became suspect. And before long, Europe collectively decided that water was out to get them. So, what happened? Well, in short, the Black Death. When the bubonic plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it didn't just kill millions. It killed confidence, in medicine, in science, in everything. People were desperate to explain why half the population had suddenly died. And because bacteria were still a few centuries away from discovery, they had to improvise. One popular theory was the idea of miasma, bad air. The belief that disease was spread by invisible, poisonous vapors drifting through the air. Anything that opened your pores was thought to make you vulnerable to this invisible menace. And what opens your pores? heat, steam, bathing. So naturally, the conclusion was, stay dirty. For your health. Doctors began warning that bathing softened the body and weakened the natural defenses. Clean skin was seen as porous, dangerously receptive to illness. Dirty skin, on the other hand, formed a kind of protective crust. Like a medieval hazmat suit made of grime. People genuinely believed that washing too often made you sick. And, to be fair, given the quality of medieval plumbing, they weren't entirely wrong. See, most medieval towns didn't have clean water. Streams and wells were easily contaminated by human waste, animal waste, or whatever happened to be floating downstream that day. So washing in it could actually cause disease. The irony was profound, but not lost on anyone. When every river is also a sewer, personal hygiene becomes a gamble. So, between miasma theory and contaminated water, the medieval mind reached a logical conclusion. Soap bad. Dirt good. That said, this didn't mean people never bathed. They just did it differently, and much less often. Most people settled for what they called a dry wash. Which is a generous way of saying, wiping yourself with a cloth and pretending that counts. They used linen towels, scented oils, and powders to remove, or perhaps just redistribute, the dirt. Perfume became the great substitute for water. If you couldn't wash it off, you could at least cover it up. The result was that medieval Europe smelled complex. The wealthy, as usual, found ways to make it glamorous. Noble ladies used rose water or lavender-infused cloths. They believed fragrance was a kind of armor against disease. If the air around you smelled sweet, it must be healthy. And, to be fair, in the middle of a crowded banquet hall filled with unwashed nobles and half-rotten food, a little rose water probably helped morale. But back to the bathhouse, those once cheerful dens of soap and scandal. By the 15th century, bathhouses were closing all over Europe. Authorities banned them during plague outbreaks. Moralists denounced them as sinful, which, in fairness, they often were. Bathing had become associated with immorality, indulgence, and contagion. So the public bath fell out of favor. Private baths, meanwhile, were rare. Heating water was time-consuming, expensive, and occasionally dangerous. Open fires, boiling water, slippery floors. So most people just didn't bother. Monks and nuns were told to limit bathing to a few times a year. 4, if you were lucky. Less, if you were holy. Cleanliness, they argued, was a distraction from spiritual purity. After all, saints were known for their souls, not their hygiene. One monk proudly recorded that he hadn't washed in decades. He described it as a triumph of faith. Those sitting next to him probably described it differently. Even kings weren't immune to this mindset. Take Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, one of the most lavish monarchs in history. He bathed twice in his life. He preferred to be rubbed with scented alcohol and powdered liberally instead. His doctors advised him that bathing might cause chills. And naturally, he listened. Visitors to Versailles often remarked that the palace smelled different. Which was the polite 17th century way of saying unbearable. His courtiers followed suit. Perfume became so essential that it practically replaced personal cleanliness. If you could afford to smell nice, no one dared to suggest you weren't. Let's drift back a bit, to the medieval common folk. They didn't have the luxury of perfume, but they had rivers. And, for much of the early Middle Ages, they did bathe in them. Peasants often washed in streams during summer, or sat in wooden tubs filled with water heated over the hearth. It wasn't daily, or even weekly, but it happened. Laundry days sometimes doubled as bathing days. The whole family would make a day of it. Practical, efficient, slightly awkward. But over time, as the fear of water grew, even this modest routine declined. So how did people stay relatively clean? Well, they didn't, not by modern standards. But they managed. They changed linen often, that was key. Medieval people understood that dirty linen caused body odor, even if they didn't know why. So they washed their shirts and underclothes frequently, sometimes daily. Their skin might not be clean, but their linens were, which helped. Linen absorbed sweat and oils, keeping the upper layers of clothing fresher. It was the medieval version of showering in your laundry. There's also an overlooked detail: medieval homes were smoky. Constant fires filled them with ash, soot, and fumes. The smell of wood smoke clung to everything. It masked body odor, and possibly preserved it. Between that and the constant smell of livestock, open sewers, and tallow candles, people simply stopped noticing. You can't smell bad if everything smells bad. It's all about perspective. Some doctors, to their credit, still recommended bathing, cautiously. Warm baths were prescribed for melancholy or gout. Cold baths were said to strengthen the body. But always with warnings. Don't bathe on an empty stomach. Don't bathe after eating. Don't bathe if it's windy. Don't bathe if you feel sad. By the time you finished reading the medical advice, you'd probably decided to stay dirty. Yet, in a curious twist, medieval Islamic societies never abandoned bathing. Across the Middle East and North Africa, public baths, hammams, remained central to daily life. Cleanliness was tied to religion, health, and hospitality. And visitors from Europe often remarked, somewhat jealously, on how pleasant it all seemed. But back home, Christian Europe clung to its dirt with a kind of moral pride. To wash too often was vanity. To avoid it entirely was virtue. By the Renaissance, attitudes began to shift again, slowly. New ideas about medicine, and rediscovered Roman texts, revived the notion that clean might actually be good. Still, for many centuries, bathing remained a suspicious luxury. Even as plumbing improved, old fears lingered. People continued to believe that washing could let disease enter through the skin. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries, with the rise of germ theory, that Europe truly embraced cleanliness again. Until then, the safest way to stay healthy was, apparently, to stay crusty. Let's drift for a moment to the practical experience of bathing, for those brave enough to try. Picture it. A wooden tub, filled by hand, one bucket at a time. The water heated over the hearth, then carried, sloshing, to the tub. By the time it was full, it was already cooling. The head of the household went first. Then the wife. Then the children, in order of importance or resistance. By the end, the water was less bath and more stew. Hence the saying, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." It wasn't just a metaphor. Even in the late Middle Ages, when some nobles kept private tubs, they used them rarely. Henry VIII had a portable bath made of pewter. It folded up for travel. He used it occasionally, though more often as decoration. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, claimed to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. Which, in her time, was practically obsessive. So why, you might wonder, did no one rebel against this? Surely someone realized that washing felt nice? Some did. Writers in the late 15th century began quietly suggesting that maybe, just maybe, dirt wasn't holy. But it took centuries, and a lot of illness, for the idea to catch on. Until then, the medieval world remained convinced that cleanliness was next to godlessness. So tonight, as you sink deeper into your blankets, take comfort in your modern luxuries. Your running water. Your warm shower. Your scented soap. For most of history, those things were feared, avoided, or dismissed as indulgent. And yet, somehow, people survived. Unwashed, unbothered, and quietly confident that filth kept them safe. It's oddly comforting, in its own way. Because if the Middle Ages taught us anything, it's that humanity can rationalize anything, even not bathing, if it's inconvenient enough. How did royalty deal with bad teeth in medieval dentistry? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're sinking slowly into one of the less glamorous corners of royal life. A place where crowns didn't sparkle quite so brightly, and smiles, well, didn't sparkle at all. Because tonight, we're talking about teeth. Specifically, how the great kings and queens of history dealt with their bad ones. Before toothbrushes. Before toothpaste. Before anesthetic. And very much before the invention of subtlety in dental care. So, settle in. Maybe run your tongue over your own teeth, just to remind yourself how lucky you are. And let's drift back to a time when toothache was a royal crisis, and dentistry was, quite literally, hit or miss. Let's start with a simple fact: for most of history, everyone had bad teeth. Even the rich. Especially the rich. Sugar was the great dental villain, and royalty had it in abundance. It was imported from distant lands, expensive, and seen as a mark of wealth. The whiter your sugar, the higher your status. And the more you had, the faster your teeth disintegrated. By the late Middle Ages, sugar had become fashionable among Europe's elite. Kings and queens sprinkled it on fruit, in wine, on meat, basically, on anything that didn't already hurt their teeth. So it's no surprise that by their 30s, many nobles were suffering from severe tooth decay. Some were nearly toothless. And those still smiling, probably shouldn't have been. Take Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, England's glittering monarch, and part-time sugar addict. She loved sweets. Candied violets, sugared fruit, marzipan castles, you name it. Her teeth, by all accounts, were a disaster. Foreign ambassadors noted that her teeth were blackened, though they tactfully blamed it on fashion rather than decay. In truth, her smile was the product of decades of indulgence and neglect. She tried to cover the damage with lipstick, heavy powder, and strategic lighting. But by her final years, eating was painful, and speaking clearly wasn't easy. Still, her courtiers followed suit, darkening their own teeth to imitate her. Because of course they did. If the queen had black teeth, then black teeth must be beautiful. Nothing says loyalty like matching your monarch's cavities. Before toothbrushes were common, people improvised. They used twigs, chew sticks, from aromatic trees like mastic or rosemary. You'd chew one end until it frayed into a brush-like tuft, then rub it across your teeth. It worked, to a degree. At least until splinters became part of the experience. Others preferred cloths, dipped in vinegar or wine, to wipe their teeth. Some medieval recipes even called for ashes or crushed eggshells. The logic was, if it's gritty, it must clean. Unfortunately, many of these mixtures stripped away enamel faster than plaque. But in fairness, enamel was not yet a known concept. Now, you might assume that royal dentists were professionals. They were not. In the Middle Ages, dentist wasn't really a job, If you needed a tooth pulled, you went to the barber. Yes, the same person who cut your hair and occasionally performed minor surgery. They were called barber surgeons. And if that title doesn't fill you with confidence, congratulations, you're sane. The barber's tools included razors, saws, and occasionally, pliers. For teeth, the preferred instrument was a tooth key, a small metal wrench used to twist and yank teeth from the jaw. Without anesthetic, of course. Just a prayer and perhaps a stiff drink. If the tooth broke, they'd dig out the rest with a knife. If it got infected afterward, well, that was between you and God. Royalty, of course, had slightly more refined options, but only slightly. Kings and queens might summon a court physician, who would apply herbal poultices or oils to draw out the pain. A common remedy was clove oil, which numbs the gums slightly. Another was to hold a roasted onion against the cheek. Neither was especially effective, though arguably better than a barber with pliers. Some physicians recommended bleeding, because naturally, blood loss cures everything. Others prescribed amulets or charms. One popular cure for toothache was to wear a dead mole's foot around your neck. And if that didn't work, at least it distracted you from the pain. Let's drift for a moment to Louis XIV, the Sun King, radiant, majestic, and profoundly dental challenged. By his 40s, Louis had lost most of his teeth. His breath was famously unbearable. His gums were infected, his jaw swollen. Eventually, his royal dentist decided to remove them all, in one session. No anesthesia, no antiseptic. Just a metal lever and a prayer to Saint Apollonia, patron saint of toothache. The result was disastrous. Part of his upper jaw came away with the teeth, creating a hole between his mouth and nasal cavity. Food and drink leaked from his nose. He could no longer chew, and speaking became painful. Yet court etiquette required him to continue holding banquets. So he did, sipping soup through clenched lips, pretending nothing was wrong. Because of course he did. By comparison, Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France and noted connoisseur of cosmetics, had a much more elegant approach. She imported dentists from Italy, who made her mouthwash from crushed pearls and white wine. It didn't help much, but it certainly sounded luxurious. Pearl dust was thought to whiten the teeth. It also probably made them worse. But in the Renaissance, if it sparkles, it heals was a legitimate medical philosophy. Let's drift a little earlier, to medieval England, where dental care was a mix of superstition and experimentation. The Leech Book of Bald, a 10th century English medical text, offered several remedies for toothache. One involved boiling herbs and vinegar and gargling the result. Another suggested burning a certain type of worm and mixing the ashes with honey. You were then supposed to apply it directly to the offending tooth. The logic is unclear. Perhaps the worm's suffering was meant to appease whatever spirit lived in your molars. And indeed, for much of medieval Europe, toothache was seen as demonic. Tiny creatures, toothworms, were said to burrow inside the tooth and cause pain. This theory persisted for centuries. It even made its way into early modern medical illustrations, complete with charmingly detailed sketches of smiling worms. Naturally, the cure was to smoke them out. People held burning candles, incense, or even mercury near their mouths, hoping the worms would flee. They didn't, of course. But the patient usually passed out before they could complain. Among peasants, the approach was even more direct: find someone strong, have them pull. Blacksmiths were popular choices: strong, steady hands, good with iron tools. It wasn't uncommon to have a tooth extracted in the town square, often during market day. A public performance, complete with cheering crowds and occasional fainting. The early modern version of reality TV. Traveling tooth drawers became minor celebrities. They wandered from town to town, performing extractions to the sound of drums and flutes. Theatrics helped distract from the pain. And for the audience, it was cheap entertainment. Royalty preferred privacy, though not comfort. They relied on their court physicians, who often wrote detailed letters about the experience. One such letter, from a Tudor courtier, describes a queen enduring an extraction with the fortitude of a saint. Translation: she screamed politely. Afterward, she was given wine, cloves, and sometimes opium. Then praised for her courage, and reminded not to cry, lest it seem unqueenly. False teeth existed, though they were imperfect. Early dentures were made from bone, ivory, or human teeth, often purchased from the poor, or taken from corpses after battles. By the 17th century, Waterloo teeth became a lucrative trade, harvested from fallen soldiers. Yes, people quite literally smiled with the teeth of the dead. Royalty sometimes commissioned elaborate sets, carved from walrus ivory or even silver. They looked impressive, but functionally, they were a disaster. They didn't fit well, and they clattered audibly when the wearer spoke. A banquet full of nobles adjusting their dentures must have sounded like a room full of castanets. Despite the horror, oral hygiene slowly improved, mostly thanks to global trade. When Europeans encountered other cultures, they discovered new habits. The Islamic world, for instance, used miswak, a natural toothbrush made from the salvadora tree. It cleaned effectively, smelled pleasant, and didn't rely on superstition. Gradually, European nobles adopted toothpicks and small brushes. By the 1600s, a few were even using primitive toothpaste, a mixture of chalk, salt, and burnt bread. Which is about as appetizing as it sounds. But progress, like plaque removal, takes time. Let's drift briefly to George Washington, centuries later, often rumored to have wooden teeth. They weren't wood, technically. They were a mix of human, cow, and ivory teeth, set in metal springs. They looked terrible and hurt constantly. But they worked, mostly. When he smiled, the dentures squeaked slightly. When he ate, they slipped. And when he spoke, they whistled faintly, a sound every portrait politely ignored. Still, compared to medieval monarchs, Washington was practically a dental visionary. Returning to the Middle Ages, though, most people simply endured. Toothache was one of life's constants, a dull, throbbing reminder of mortality. It came with age, with wealth, with sugar. And for royalty, who feasted daily on sweetmeats and wine, it was almost inevitable. When all else failed, they prayed to Saint Apollonia, who had her teeth pulled out during martyrdom and thus became the go-to saint for oral suffering. Churches even kept her relics, tiny bone fragments, said to cure pain when touched. Some kissed them. Some rubbed them on their cheeks. Most, sadly, still ended up at the barber's chair. So next time you brush your teeth before bed, gently, efficiently, without risk of infection or decapitation, take a moment to appreciate how far humanity has come. Your toothpaste isn't made of ashes. Your dentist doesn't double as a barber. And your molars, blessedly, are not a luxury item. The royals of the past might have had crowns on their heads, but rarely any left on their teeth. And that's as humbling as it is soothing. So rest easy. Your smile is safe. And in the long, grimy saga of human hygiene, that's nothing short of miraculous. How did medieval royals smell? The perfumed politics of power. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting into a quieter corner of medieval life. Not the battlefield. Not the banquet hall. Somewhere far less discussed, yet far more noticeable. Because tonight, we're talking about how medieval royalty smelled. Or, perhaps more accurately, how they tried not to. So if you've brushed your teeth, washed your face, and maybe even lit a candle, congratulations. You are already centuries ahead of most crowned heads in history. Now settle in. Dim the lights. And let's wander softly through the perfumed, pungent world of the Middle Ages. Before we start judging too harshly, let's remember, the concept of smelling good or bad hasn't always been consistent. In the medieval mind, odors weren't just physical. They were moral. A sweet scent implied holiness or virtue. A foul one suggested sin, corruption, or possibly demonic influence. This was a world before germ theory, where people genuinely believed disease floated through the air, carried by mists, or by bad air, known as miasma. So when you smelled something awful, you weren't just offended. You were in danger. Naturally, the wealthy responded in the only way they knew how. They made everything smell louder. Let's begin with what the royal body itself contributed to the olfactory landscape. Contrary to romantic myth, not every medieval noble was filthy. Many did try to stay clean, within reason. The problem was that clean didn't mean what it does now. Bathing, as we've discussed before, was considered risky. Warm water opened the pores, people said, and invited sickness to slip inside. So instead of scrubbing daily, the fashionable elite simply covered up the evidence. They changed linen shirts often, sometimes daily, if they could afford it. Not because the shirts were cleaner, but because they absorbed sweat and oils. The theory went, if the linen stays white, the body stays pure. It didn't, but it was a nice thought. Now, let's picture a royal court in summer. Layers upon layers of velvet, fur, and brocade. Headdresses, hose, thick tunics. No deodorant. Minimal airflow. And in the center, your monarch, radiating both majesty and a faint bouquet of humanity. Even so, this was considered normal. Everyone smelled of something: musk, sweat, horse, candle smoke, and faint traces of wine. It was, you might say, the scent of civilization. But royalty, of course, went further. They didn't just smell human. They smelled expensive. Perfume was an essential part of courtly life, not just for beauty, but for survival. The air was believed to carry illness, so surrounding yourself with pleasant odors was like wearing armor against disease. Perfume wasn't vanity, it was medicine. Scented oils, herbs, and flowers were burned in rooms, sewn into clothing, even tucked into wigs and headdresses. Royal wardrobes often smelled like entire gardens trying to escape. And, in many cases, they were literally stuffed with dried lavender, cloves, and rosemary. These herbs weren't just for fragrance, they were thought to purify the air, to drive away evil, and occasionally, to hide the smell of decay. Because medieval castles did not smell good. Let's float gently through one, shall we? Stone walls, drafty corridors, smoky fireplaces. Animals in the courtyard, cooks in the kitchen, and latrines positioned conveniently near the moat, which, you may recall, doubled as a kind of open sewer. Add a few dozen servants, some rotting rushes on the floor, and an overripe banquet or two, and the overall aroma can best be described as medieval musk. To combat this, Courtiers carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with herbs and perfume. You'd hold one near your nose when things got particularly unpleasant. Some even wore them as necklaces or attached them to belts. The medieval equivalent of walking around with your own personal air freshener. One of the most famous fans of fragrance was Queen Elizabeth I. Yes, her again, our sugar-addicted, black-toothed monarch of England. But this time, her obsession was olfactory rather than culinary. Elizabeth surrounded herself with sweet smells. Her gloves were soaked in perfumed oils, her rooms filled with rose petals and ambergris, a rare, waxy substance produced in the intestines of whales. Yes, whale intestines. Because of course, the world's most regal scents must first pass through a digestive tract. Ambergris was absurdly valuable. It had a musky, earthy aroma that lasted for months, even years. The upper classes adored it. Modern noses, perhaps less so. Still, Elizabeth's perfumers blended it into everything, her soaps, her gloves, even her letters. Her correspondence quite literally smelled royal. But the English court was almost restrained compared to the extravagance of France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was practically a perfume factory. His court at Versailles revolved around scent. Every room had its own fragrance. Every day began with powders, oils, and scented linens. His gloves were perfumed, his wigs dusted with violet powder, his clothes steeped in rose water. He adored strong smells, especially orange blossom, musk, and jasmine. And given that Versailles was, let's say, lacking in plumbing, the perfume had serious work to do. Visitors often complained that the palace smelled like a strange mix of flowers and filth, a clash of heaven and humanity. But no one dared say that to the king. If Louis wanted to smell like citrus and sewage, then so did everyone else. Perfume, for royalty, wasn't just hygiene, it was hierarchy. Scent was status. The rich could afford rare ingredients, ambergris, civet, musk. Each one came from somewhere improbable. Civet from the glands of African cats. Musk from deer. Ambergris from whales. In other words, the aroma of empire.